Hi everyone, I'm Lisa and my lovely assistant here today with me is Kathy, and we are bringing you a whole new show called The Vintage Kitchen. And I am super excited about bringing this to you today because I want to be able to show you how you can bring recipes from the past to life and it can still meet the needs of a modern cook and our modern palates. So today I have for you an apple custard pie from 1882. Now, many of us think today about American as apple pie. It's something we eat almost year-round, whether it's around the holidays or for 4th of July even. But believe it or not, American apple pie, it's not quite as American as you might think because the ingredients to make this originated from all over the world. So today in the Vintage Kitchen, we'll be making this apple pie, not completely from start to finish. We'll show you some of the important stages of it. And as we go along, I'm going to show you and share with you actually a little bit of food history about the ingredients or about the recipe in general. So let's go ahead and get started. With an apple custard pie, we're going to do it in 2 stages. We're going to be making our homemade applesauce first, and then we'll be making the custard part. So to get started today, we have a knife and a cutting board. If you have an apple peeler or corer, something like that to help get the skin off the apples, that will help. You'll need a saucepan or sauce pot, not small but not huge either. You'll need some kind of liquid measuring or a tablespoon for a little bit of liquid. We'll talk about that in a moment. You'll also need a spoon or a spatula. And then also our final step in making the applesauce, you'll need either a food mill, a sieve, a food processor, or a blender to chop it up nice and fine. So that's the first part. Now the second part, we'll be making a custard. And with that, we're going to need a small bowl or a ramekin. If you want to melt the butter in the microwave, you can, or you can do it over the stove. So that or a pot. You'll also need a medium or large size bowl to put your egg custard mixture in, and a whisk, and then a 1/3 measuring cup for your sugar. So that's the ingredients we need for our custard. Now to get it into the pie, of course, you'll need a pie pan. Now you can choose whether or not you want to do a refrigerated pie crust or a frozen one. If that's the case, you may or may not need a pie plate. But if you're doing a pie crust from scratch, you'll need your own pie plate as well. It might be also helpful to have a protector ring or some aluminum foil to protect your crust so it doesn't get burned. And then you'll also need a pastry brush and then a cookie sheet to put it on in case there's any spills. So those are ingredients, our equipment to get started. Let's take a look at our ingredients now. So you're going to need about 4 to 5, maybe even 6 tart apples. About 2 pounds. I usually do a little bit more just to give us plenty of room because once you cut the core and the peels off, it'll reduce your weight and size. Today we're going to use Granny Smith's, and I'll talk more a little bit about that. You'll need either a few tablespoons of water to put in with your apples, and if your apples aren't tart enough, you can try to have something like lemon juice, or if you want to try something a little bit more historic in flavor, even rose water, which was a popular flavoring during colonial times. You'll also need 3 eggs for your custard, 1/3 of a cup sugar, and 5.5 ounces or 1/3 of a cup of butter, and then some nutmeg on top, and then you need your pie crust. So fairly simple ingredients, but I guarantee you this will definitely be interesting for the modern palate. You'll find that this recipe is not going to be overly sweet, but that apple flavor, that tart apple flavor will shine through. So to get us started today, we've got some Granny Smith apples. And I thought I would share with you briefly a little bit of apple food history to get us going. So something that might not be surprising to you. Now, apples are kind of ubiquitous here in America, but believe it or not, apples are not native to North America. The only thing that grew here was crab apples. So it was actually Europeans who brought apples from their travels, their place in Europe here to America, and very quickly started growing apple orchards as well. Now, the apples that we have growing today are Granny Smiths. Now, here's something that's very interesting. There were in North America about 14,000 different varieties of apples developed from the colonial era up through the 1800s and early 1900s even. But today, for the world table, we have about 20 apples that are grown to meet the needs. And these apple varieties that are lost, some are being located, found in random meadows, hidden in different orchards that are hiding. And people are trying to bring these heirloom apples back because their flavors are so much more intense. A lot of our apples today, the flavor isn't what they used to be. And tart apples were quite common back then because they were using it to make cider, of course, pies. And it was just very common to find apples at the table, especially during colonial times. Today we have a Granny Smith apple, and they are grown here in Virginia, of course. Believe it or not, Virginia is about 5th or 6th in the nation for apple growing, apple production here. But Granny Smith apples aren't native to Virginia or even the United States. They actually came from Australia, and they got started around 1868. But they're quite popular today, of course. And they didn't make their way over here to the United States until the 1970s. So that's a little bit of apple history for you. So our first step is we're going to make the applesauce. So once you've washed and peeled your apples, you're going to want to cut them up. And our slices today are about 1/8 of an inch thick. Oh, do we have a question?
Lisa, I have a question for you.
Okay, we do have a question, yes.
Can you use another apple beside Granny Smith?
Oh, so our question is, can you use another apple besides Granny Smith? Absolutely. You can use another apple. I would recommend a tart apple, so definitely try to find that. And there are some, like I said, heirloom apples that are starting to be grown. One famous apple that Thomas Jefferson actually loved, called the Albemarle Pippin, is starting to be grown back in Virginia, so you can get something like that. But the goal is to get a tart apple. Now, if you don't want to go through the steps of cutting, because as I was saying, you're going to want to cut these very thin, only 1/8 of an inch thick, you can try a shortcut. Now, I did try this shortcut, and I don't know how much of a shortcut it really is. You can get applesauce. Now, I would recommend, if you get applesauce, to not get any sugar added. And also, if you can find a tart variety like a Granny Smith version, that certainly can be helpful as well. But here's what I found. Instead of saving you the time cutting the apples, which it does, you have to get the extra moisture, the extra water out of the applesauce. And that seemed to take just as long, if not longer, than the amount of time it took to slice up all my apples. And at least with just a generic apple brand that wasn't Granny Smith, the flavor and the texture just did not come through and shine. So keep that in mind if you think you want to do a shortcut. Sometimes shortcuts are not all what they've meant to be. And Kathy helped taste test earlier, and we can certainly attest that this just didn't compete with it. So yes, you can use other tart apples, but just make sure they have flavor. Now, if your tart apples, taste them. If they don't taste tart enough, you can add some lemon juice instead of your few tablespoons of water. So I ended up adding about 4 tablespoons of water to this. But if you want to make it tartar, then add some lemon juice, or like I said, you can substitute rose water flavoring in. But the liquid is there so that the apples don't stick to the pan, and it helps steam them. And you might wonder, well, why should you try to take all this time to slice the apples so thinly? And it's for 2 reasons. You want to make sure the apples cook as fast as they can, and this will speed up the cook time. But you also want to keep them off the cook time. You want to get them off the heat as quick as possible. The longer the time on the heat, the more time or the more flavor kind of drains down. The brightness is lost. So that's why you want to spend the time trying to slice them about 1/8 of an inch thick. So once you have your apples all sliced up here, the next step is you're going to want to add them to your pot, your saucepan, with the water or the lemon juice or the rose water flavoring. And you're going to bring it up to a boil on medium heat at this point. Now, what you're looking for, I've timed it, it takes about maybe 20 to 30 minutes depending on your stovetop. But what you're wanting to look for when you do this is the recipe will tell you, you want to get the apples not just soft, but they're going to start getting thick. And if you've never made homemade applesauce, you might not be sure what that quite looks like. And so I'll show you here that you can see that the apples are starting to break down, and you can't see all of the slices. And really you want to try to get this liquid out of your applesauce, because you need the applesauce to be able to hold its shape within the pie. So that's why we're cooking this down. Now, once it's all cooked down, just keep an eye on it. You need to keep stirring it with a spoon or a spatula so it doesn't stick to the bottom. But once you're ready, then you're going to put the apples into your food processor, your sieve, your food mill, whatever you have, to actually make your applesauce. And it doesn't take long to make it all. This is actually pretty easy to do. So this is what it looks like when we're all done. You can see it kind of looks like your regular applesauce, and it's a little hard to tell, but it is thicker than your store-bought applesauce. And that's why we're saying you should cook down your store-bought applesauce to get that extra moisture out. If there's too much liquid, your pie is just not going to hold together. So you've got your applesauce made at this point, and that can be put aside. So now we can move on to our custard part. And you know, it was interesting when I was looking through recipes, there's tons of recipes out there in historic cookbooks for apple pies. In fact, some of the earliest in print were in the 1400s. They started making versions of apple pie, although it didn't taste like and look like ours. And I'll talk more about the pie part in a little bit once we get our custard done. But the first time an American apple pie that we know of showed up in print was in 1796. It was called the American Cookery by Amelia Simmons. We don't know much about this cook. In fact, there may have never actually even been an Amelia Simmons. It might have been a pseudonym for someone else even. You just never know. But she did include 2 different versions of an apple pie in there, but not an apple custard pie. So trying to trace this evolution through the cookbooks, it's a little different. I haven't really found this recipe kind of appeared out of nowhere. Perhaps with more research, more will come in, where they had the idea of combining applesauce with a custard. But it does come out to be something very different, but also very tasty. So let's work on getting the custard made. Now, if you've never made custard before, it's pretty easy to do. What I did was I took my 3 eggs, and I just whisked them to break up the egg yolks and mix them with the whites. And then I took my 1/3 cup sugar and whisked that in as well to make sure it's all mixed together. Now, the recipe calls for some melted butter. The key is you want to make sure that this butter is nice and cooled, because if you put it in hot, you're going to end up with scrambled eggs. So you don't want to do that. But we're just going to gently whisk this in and get it all nice and mixed up together. Now, if you're running short on time, you can try to temper your eggs, where you pour a little bit of your egg mixture in with the hot butter to mix it up. But really, it doesn't take that long for the butter to cool. So we have our custard mixture here. So now, all we need to do is assemble the pie. And this is the fun part. I will take a quick little pause here to explain a little bit more about pie history, since I promised a little bit about that. So I mentioned earlier that pies were not quite American. Well, if you think about all the ingredients, apples actually originated in Asia and made their way along the Silk Road in Europe. Wheat came from the Middle Eastern area. Spices like nutmeg came from some of the Indonesian islands. So really, American apple pie is this wonderful blend. And if you think about it, America is the melting pot. So this does kind of define us in that sense. But some of the earlier pies that had apples in it started in England. There was a bit of a difference, as I hinted to earlier. There typically wasn't sugar. Sugar in the 1400s was incredibly expensive. The crust, which was called a coffin, it's kind of morbid, but it wasn't meant to be eaten. You're just eating the contents. It was more of a way to cook it. It's a cooking vessel. And also, they tended to mix in with the apples other things. Anything from raisins and figs and different seasonings like saffron, which you wouldn't think of would be tasty. But saffron was expensive, just like it is today. That hasn't changed. So this pie would not have been something your average person would have eaten at all. But things progressed pretty quickly because by the 1500s, you start seeing a pie that's emerging that's going to look like our modern apple pies today. And England seemed to be quite a commonplace. The Dutch also had versions of apple pie as well. So as I said in the beginning, the colonists are bringing these apples and these pies to America. And you know, even that first apple pie recipe I mentioned that Amelia Simmons published in 1796, it had some flavors you might not have expected, along with some flavors you might expect. So it had sugar, thank goodness. And I would think with the tart apples, that would be helpful as well. It had spices like cinnamon and mace in it, but it also had lemon peel, and sometimes they added rose water. Now, she didn't give any exact measurements. It was all to taste. So a cook at that time would know exactly how much they would want to put in there. And by the 1500s, you're able to eat the crust now. They're starting to put some sugar in the crust. And the other close thing that I could think of that might be equivalent to this apple pie for the custard part is something called a Marlborough pie. Marlborough pies had eggs and cream added in it, but it still wasn't the same because it wasn't quite the applesauce that we had and the custard on top. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add in the applesauce.
I'm going to do the pie first.
Yeah, in just a second. So we want to prepare our pie crust. And this is so things don't stick. So you're just going to take a little bit of your egg mixture, and you want to just brush it all along the bottom and the sides of your crust. It doesn't take long to do, but it will certainly help. And we almost got it here. Let's finish the side. It's a little gooey, but it still works very nicely. All right, and then we're going to add in our applesauce mixture. And you might have a little bit of extra. It depends on whether you want to get a deep dish pie. I have a deep dish here. I just love deep dish pies. But just make sure you leave room for the custard on top. I wouldn't fill it, definitely not over 3/4 full with the applesauce. But you can do a little less than that if you need to. And you want to just smooth it down, give a nice little bed for the custard to lay on here. Get one final bit here. And we're almost done, believe it or not. This isn't, other than waiting for it to bake. We just want to smooth it out nice and evenly here as best we can. All right. And then we're going to pour our custard egg mixture with the sugar on top. Almost got it all here. Uh-oh. Sorry. Had a little bit of egg on the side there. We'll get that all cleaned up and smoothed out. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to sprinkle a little bit of nutmeg on top. Now, I'll warn you with the nutmeg on top, you can use other spices if you want. It's not a problem. But just keep in mind when you're cooking it, it's going to cook to the point where it's going to make it look a little darker than what it is. So don't be concerned about that at all. So we're just going to give it a good sprinkling of nutmeg. If you want to use fresh nutmeg and grate it over the top, you certainly can. And we're pretty much ready to go. So you're going to put it in a preheated oven at 425 degrees. Keep in mind, the bake time might vary with your oven. So it may take my oven took about 35 minutes for it to set. You just want to make sure the custard's cooked through, but just keep an eye on it. And I would recommend putting a pie crust ring or some foil around the top so the crust doesn't burn. But there you go. We've got some pictures to show you the final baked version of what it looked like, and you can see there the layers of the custard and the applesauce underneath. So it comes through very beautifully with, like I said, the Granny Smith apples. But are there any questions for any of our participants about how to make this apple custard pie from 1882?
There are no questions. That was delightful. Thank you.
There are no questions. Well, thank you all for joining us in this episode of The Vintage Kitchen. Please be sure to join us again. We'll be doing a couple of these episodes in December, and I'll just have to wait to reveal the surprise of which ones we're going to be doing. But it'll be something sweet. I do have a bit of a sweet tooth, as you'll learn as we go through. But thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy making this. We'll have the recipe posted for you to follow as well. Thanks for joining us.